Good afternoon. So, Dr. Carl Jung was a very frank man. And finally, after a lifetime of obfuscating what he was really about, he decided to tell the truth. And the truth that he was referring to in this case was the truth about all the world religions. And he said at one time that um, the great religions of the world are grand methods for psychotherapy. And so, what they did over the years was they helped people at a time when there were no psychologists and no psychiatrists. They evolved a system to help us live with um, the chaos of our own psyches, let's put it that way. And so, in fact, there's this book, very good book, called Sacred Chaos: Reflections on God's Shadow and the Dark Self. And so, Dr. Jung made it very clear in paragraph 752 of Answer to Job that every religious statement of whatever kind is a statement of the psyche. It's not a statement of the physical world. And then 2 paragraphs later, he suggested in paragraph 754 of this book, Answer to Job, that Christian theologians should reinterpret all of the Christian traditions in the context of the psyche. Because over the last 500 years, we now know, and rationality has proven to us, that there's no God up there. There's no devil down there. All of these things are in our heart. And the books of the Bible are stories that teach us about what Dr. Jung called the divine drama, the story of how we need to develop in order to properly function in the modern world. And, there are other holy books from other religions, and they all also do something very similar. But for the purposes of the next few days, I'm going to refer to the Bible. And so, theologians have been selling magical thinking for 3,500 years. Ever since Moses came off the mountain with the slabs with the laws on them, perhaps, maybe longer than that. And probably going back even to Abraham. And so magical thinking is all well and good, but in modern categories of understanding, we don't understand it that way. And so we need to understand why we need to look back at the world's religions. And the reason we do is because they are naturally evolved systems of psychotherapy. And they're, in general, less expensive than going to a therapist at $150 an hour to deal um, with your depression or whatever it is. And so Dr. Jung wrote about this his whole life, and especially the last 4 major books that he wrote after 1944, after his near-death experience. And Dr. Edward Edinger dedicated his life to making what Dr. Jung found more approachable by you and me. He made it so that we could understand what Dr. Jung is saying. And so he wrote, I think it's 17 volumes. I'm not exactly sure how many. Mostly talking about religion in the context of psychology. Hello, Nina. And hello, Grenade. Gwen, welcome. Hello, Dan. Nice to see you. And I was in church yesterday and was thinking about the way it mistreats other religions. And that's the problem. That's one of the major problems that we have in the 21st century and what we have to start doing. Because we have to understand that all these systems, everyone's religion, is pointing at the same thing. And we need to have our theologians start referring back to one another and seeing what others may have figured out that they haven't. And so I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you here. I mean, if you go to a pastor or a priest or maybe a rabbi, I'm not sure, they probably will tell you that, you know, after you die, you're either going to go to heaven or hell or purgatory. Or, you know, what is that? What is that? Even Buddhism is designed to make you be prepared for your ultimate death. And the medieval monks were all in, you know, when they would greet each other in the morning, they would say, memento mori, meaning remember death. And so let's talk about a truth about death for a moment. And I point to a secular friend of mine, Meltem Arikhan, for this. When you're dead, you don't know you're dead. It's only difficult for your family. When you're stupid, it works the same way. And so I'm going to presume that everybody that has subscribed to this YouTube channel is smart enough to understand what that means. And that does not mean that we are going to throw the world's religions out. Dr. Edinger pointed out that we're now in the third phase of religions supporting the human family. The first phase was, or the first semi-modern phase, let's say, was the phase of the law, when Moses came off the mountain and he had the 10 Commandments. That was the law. And a civilization could be built around the law. And that worked for a while, but ultimately something further was needed, and that was the birth of Christ. And that ushered in 2,000 years of belief instead of the law. But that approach has corrupted, let's say, especially in the last 500 years with the so-called Enlightenment. It was actually an endarkenment, because it could say that certain aspects of religious myth were untrue, but it couldn't say what was true, and it couldn't offer an alternative. And the alternative is that actually they're true. And they're true because all of us have to develop over our lifetime psychologically. And that was traditionally done in the major religions through stories that they told. And that's what the Bible is. And so just think, if you ever had children and you wanted to teach them about something, you might have told them a story to help them understand what it was they could do. And um, and that's what the religions do also. And even if you never did that because of your own children, you probably can remember your parents getting you to do something by telling you a story. Sean says Moses broke all of the commandments at the same time. I have no doubt about that, and many of us do. I mean, we're all sinners, and if we don't if we don't admit that, we're not going to live a very balanced life. Um, and Grenade says, do you think alchemy was kept hidden because fear of persecution from the church? Yes, I absolutely do think that. And it wasn't a very healthy time to have different ideas about religion. And so they kept it hidden, but they continued to do it through 1700 years, in fact. And in the process, they invented chemistry, so more power to them. But they also invented the beginnings of psychology. And so the third stage, after the belief system has crumbled, which essentially it has, is a stage of psychology where we, in our individual hearts, understand what it is that is happening in religion. And then we can go back and look at our original religions, whatever they are. I'm not saying Christianity is the right one or Judaism. This book is actually about the Old Testament, so it's about the Jewish Bible, which also Muslims point to and also Christians point to. And so it's the period of the law. But now, because of what we know through the rational enlightenment, we know that in the physical world, religious statements are not true. But they are true in the psychological world, okay? And they're 100% true. So when a fundamentalist wants to thump on the Bible and say the Bible's 100% true, I say, yes, it is. It's 100% true. But it's 100% true for the psyche. It's not necessarily 100% true in the physical world. Certain aspects of it are, obviously, to the extent it's a historical document. And okay, sorry, Sean. So anyway, so what I'm going to do over the next 2 weeks, perhaps, is I'm going to read Edward Edinger's book entitled The Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament by Edward F. Edinger. Now, Dr. Edinger was the leading Jungian analyst of the late 20th century. He dedicated 40 years of his life to Dr. Jung's oeuvre, including trying to bring the religious aspects of it forward, which was essentially hidden by the Jungian analyst community. And he was a founder with Esther Harding of the C.G. Jung Institute in New York City. And then he moved to Los Angeles, and he used to give lectures out there. So you can find a few of his lectures, at least in audio form, on YouTube, and I urge you to listen to them. Dan says, from Jewish mythology, I liked the Zephyr Yetzirah. Okay, Good. I don't know what that is yet, but maybe we'll run into it in this book. So what I'm going to do is read this book day by day. And so I'll show you how it begins. At the beginning of the book, there is this image. Let me give it to you. Okay, so this is this image says as a caption, text of the Song of Songs arranged as a mandala. And it's from the Beneke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. And I've been doing some calligraphy lately, as some of you know. And so I know just how difficult it would be to plan this out, notwithstanding the calligraphy itself, just plan this image out so that you could do it. And it was obviously done at a time before there were PCs where you could do it much more easily. So that image was at the beginning. And then this is chapter 1. And chapter 1 is basically an introduction, and it's called The Bible and the Psyche. And there's a little Jung quote at the beginning of this chapter to sort of set the stage. It reads as follows. We must read the Bible or we shall not understand psychology. Our psychology, whole lives, our language and imagery are built upon the Bible. C.G. Jung. And that's from his Visions Seminar, Volume 1, page 156. And so, and Gwen says she has this book in her audiobook library. So this will be a different form of audiobook because it's probably going to have my commentary throughout. And so I'm going to leave it to my regular friends here who are active on the chat to continue on without my attention while I read the book, and then I'll come back to the chat. As the 21st century approaches, we are witnessing the emergence of a whole new worldview growing out of depth psychology. This new science studies the psyche as an experienceable, objective phenomenon. It takes old data and approaches them in a new way. For instance, mythology, religion, and sacred scriptures are all kinds of, and sacred scriptures of all kinds are taken out of their traditional context and understood psychologically, that is, are seen as the phenomenology of the objective psyche. From this view, the Bible is considered to be a self-revelation of the objective psyche. As Jung says, the statements made in the Holy Scriptures are also utterances of the soul. They point to realities that transcend consciousness. These entia are the archetypes of the collective unconscious. Heretofore, these transcendent psychic entities have appeared as metaphysical contents of religious dogma. But now, writes Jung, a scientific psychology must regard those transcendental intuitions that sprang from the human mind in all ages as projections, that is, as psychic contents that were extrapolated in metaphysical space and hypostatized. Okay, and that quote was from Concerning the Archetypes and the Anima Concept, Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, Collected Works 9.1, paragraph 120. It is no easy transition from the metaphysical standpoint of religious faith to the empirical standpoint of the psyche. Between these two mountain ridges lies a dark valley, the valley of lost faith, alienation, meaninglessness, and despair. For those who are perched safely on the ridge of religious faith, The psychological approach can be seen as an interesting addition to the more secure viewpoint they already possess. However, for those who consciously or unconsciously have already slipped off the ridge of faith and are in the dark valley, the discovery of the psychological approach may just possibly be life-saving. This approach is an admission of spiritual bankruptcy. It is available only to the poor in spirit. For as Jung says, quote, I am not addressing myself to the happy possessors of faith, but to those many people for whom the light has gone out, the mystery has faded, and God is dead. For most of them, there is no going back, and one does not know either whether going back is the better way. To gain an understanding of religious matters, probably all that is left us today is the psychological approach. That is why I take these thought forms that have become historically fixed, try to melt them down again, and pour them into new molds of immediate experience. And that's from Psychology and Religion, Collected Works 11, paragraph 148. The Old Testament documents a sustained dialogue between God and man as it is expressed in the sacred history of Israel. It presents us with an exceedingly rich compendium of images presenting encounters with the numinosum. These are best understood psychologically as pictures of the encounter between the ego and the self, which is the major feature of individuation. The Old Testament is thus a grand treasury of individuation symbolism. These venerable stories derive from countless individual experiences of the numinosum, and their psychic substance has been augmented through the ages by the pious worship and reflection of millions. When these facts are realized, we discover once again that the Old Testament is indeed a holy book. It is quite literally the Ark of the Covenant in which resides the power and glory of the transpersonal psyche. We must therefore approach it with caution, honoring its numinous power. The psychological approach takes the Bible as it is, in the hypothesis that the collective psyche has semi-purposely selected and arranged it over the course of the centuries. While respecting the methods of biblical criticism, the psychological standpoint is not concerned with a particular passage of the Pentateuch is not concerned that a particular passage of the Pentateuch comes from the J source rather than the E source. Also, the sequence is considered significant. The Hebrew Bible, based on the Masoretic text, 600 to 900 AD, consists of 24 books gathered into 3 parts: the law, the prophets, and the writings. So I better give you that just a moment. Okay, so this is the breakup of the Hebrew Bible. The arrangement of Old Testament books in the Christian Bible derives from the Septuagint Greek translation made from 280 to 150 BC. This arrangement emphasizes a linear developmental process consistent with the historical, time-bound quality of the Western psyche. According to this version, the Old Testament is composed of 39 books, arranged sequentially in 3 categories: 17 historical books, 5 books of wisdom and poetry, and 17 prophetic books, as shown opposite. I see this arrangement as a balance. On one side are the historical books in which Yahweh deals with Israel collectively as a nation. At this stage, individuation imagery is carried by the nation as a whole, the chosen people. On the other side are the prophetic books, each one named after a great individual who had a personal encounter with Yahweh and was fated to be an individual carrier of God consciousness. In the middle are the poetic wisdom books, with Job at their head. Job is the pivot of the Old Testament story. That is why Jung focused his Bible commentary on Job. Here, for the first time, a man encounters Yahweh as an individual and not as a function of the collective. Similarly, Yahweh did not deal with Job as a representative of Israel, but rather as an individual man. This book thus marks the transition from collective psychology to individual psychology, from group and church religion to the individual's lonely encounter with the numinosum. After Job comes the wisdom literature, as though the individual ego's encounter with the self has generated wisdom, or, as Jung puts it in answer to Job, as though the demonstration of Job's greater consciousness has obliged Yahweh to remember his feminine counterpart, divine wisdom, Sophia. And I'll refer you to Answer to Job, Psychology and Religion, Collected Works 11, paragraph 617. And to Edinger's book, Encounter with the Self, page 71. The events of the Bible, although presented as history, psychologically understood are archetypal images, that is, pleromatic events that repeatedly erupt into spatio-temporal manifestation and require an individual ego to live them out. As we read these stories with an openness to their unconscious reverberations, we recognize them to be relevant to our own most private experience. We are then reading the Bible the way Emerson tells us to read history. Quote, "The fact narrated must correspond to something in me to be credible or intelligible. We, as we read, must become Greeks, Romans, Turks, priest and king, martyr and executioner, must fasten these images to some reality in our secret experience, or we shall learn nothing rightly. What befell Asdrubal or Caesar Borgia is as much an illustration of the mind's powers and deprivations as what has befallen us. Each new law and political movement has a meaning for you. Stand before each of its tablets and say, under this mask did my Proteus nature hide itself. This remedies the defect of our too great nearness to ourselves. This throws our actions into perspective, and as crabs, goats, scorpions, the balance, and the water pot lose their meanness when hung as signs in the zodiac, so I can see my own vices without heat in the distant persons of Solomon, Alcibiades, and Cantillon." And that's from the Selected Writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson, page 124. Jung tells us that the book of Job serves as a paradigm for a certain experience of God, which has a special significance for us today. The same can be said of many other contents of the Old Testament. The new insights of depth psychology allow us to relate the mighty mythologems of the Bible to the depth experience of individuals. Christ reinterpreted the Old Testament as foreshadowing his coming. For instance, speaking to the Emmaus pilgrims, quote, beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Luke 24:27. So now at the beginning of a new eon, the individual pursuing the process of individuation may read these scriptures once again to learn those things concerning himself. So that's the end of chapter 1. And we have to recognize, therefore, that these are about us. And let's see, John Jackson is here. Welcome. John, when you say hypostatized, to make an abstract thing concrete, I thought it meant that we were taking something and saying that it was God. And good evening, Vincent. Nice to see you. For those of you that are here who don't know John Jackson is a Jungian analyst of some 40 years practice. I think he's retired now, and he's preparing to do a series of lectures in California. Unfortunately, they've been canceled due to the coronavirus. And I in no way want to take away from anything that John Jackson says about this. But anyway, I'm going to read the book for the benefit of my subscribers, and I hope we can all benefit by watching some replays of John's lectures when he gets to do them, perhaps in the fall. Let's see. So Miles says, I've read the New Testament in its entirety, but not the Old Testament. I think this will be a great primer before I read it too. Yeah, I think that's right. And Dan says, Isaac Asimov did a good analysis of the Bible too. Okay, that's great to know. We'll have to look at that. And Gwen says an added bonus. So, you know, my poor power to add and subtract, I can only read these words and ask you to interpret them the way you will. Dan, in my country, we still have remnants of the old religion, some parts even fused with Catholicism. That's what we have to do. We have to go back and refuse all these religions back together into one thing, because you know, our pastors and our rabbis and priests have been meeting together every month for at least the last 50 years. From my own personal knowledge, we have such a group meeting in Annapolis regularly. I'm aware of it. I've never attended it. I'm not a pastor, but you know, the people who take care of our spiritual life, who are the main ones who do it, they've been meeting together since forever, but they haven't shared with us, you know, normal human beings, anything that they've found, not that I've ever heard. And so it's time that it's time to look back and to see what things are worth keeping and what things are not worth keeping. And that's going to be a discussion that will probably go on for centuries. You know, in Jung's Red Book for Our Time, in the very first essay, Dr. Thomas Arst observes a conversation that Dr. Jung had, in which he was asked how long it was going to take for the new religion to emerge, and he said about 600 years. And so, I'm not going to try to organize a religion, and I don't think there's anybody here that can. What we can do is start talking about these issues, and gradually, in the way of the human species, we'll bubble to the top things that are worth everybody knowing. And, perhaps in 1,000 years, people will look back on us and think that we're quaint, as we surely are, but um, we're only each of us trying in our own way to work through these issues. And, if you look at your average church congregation, um, the congregation gets together for community reasons, certainly, um, because I, as a lawyer, want to see my friend, the politician, at church, because that's my way of interacting with him. That may not necessarily have anything to do with me spiritually. And I may have lost my faith long ago, as Dr. Jung's father had lost his faith. And so we each have to find our own way. In fact, this is what Dr. Jung said, that each of us has to find our own way, and we have to address our um, spiritual um, vacuousness. And in order to do that, we have to go back and look not only at what Dr. Jung had to say and wrote down, but how all the religions have interacted with one another, and what is the power devil and what is actual, sensible spirituality that can work in the 21st century for a world where basically we're all becoming one thing. And, before he died, Edward Edinger made the comment, which you can see on video, which says, in the end, we're all going to become one thing, or we're going to destroy ourselves. There's no two ways about it. And so as things have developed over many years, we get different factions doing this and that. And some things are power devil, and some things are based on the idea of love, the idea of life. It's interesting to see that in the Red Book, Dr. Jung observed love and life as a duality. And so you have to think about that. And, that was in the last reading I did of the Red Book, I think yesterday. And if it wasn't yesterday, it was the preceding reading, either part 6 or part 7 of the Red Book. And so each one of us is faced with this incredible world that is so much more complicated than our predecessors. The statistic that always impressed me is a man of the 16th century faced in his lifetime as much information as is contained in the Sunday New York Times, one edition. And so, the next time you see the New York Times and you see that pack of sections, that's how much information a human being got just 500 years ago. And now we're just inundated from every which way but loose, and all the containers, all the culture pots have holes in them, many. And one of those holes is the internet, because you can hear me saying something like this, which I probably would be burned at the stake 300-400 years ago for saying the things that I've said. And and I don't say that I have any profound truth. I'm just saying what I think is important, and each one of you has to make your own decision, and that is your way. And that was Dr. Jung's point in the Red Book. I mean, he says right in the beginning, in the very first part of the Red Book, when he's talking about the supreme meaning and so on, he says, this is my way. This is not your way. You have your own. And what he means is you have your own. There's no truths written in stone that you're going to find somewhere that are always true. That there just aren't. And so if you're going to have a life in this century, you're going to have to understand how you have to behave in order to keep yourself alive, number one, and reproduce, number two. You're not going to be able to reproduce unless you are acceptable to a person of the opposite sex. And since most of the following on YouTube and on this channel are men, this is advice to all men, that you have to find a way to make yourself acceptable to a woman, because the only thing that Mother Nature cares about for you is that you survive until you reproduce. 1, 2. After that, Mother Nature doesn't need you anymore. And so if you think back, I mean, I was talking about the eternal moment around Christmas time. Everything that ever happened to any of your ancestors, going all the way back to single-celled organisms, adds up to you looking at this video right this minute. Okay, this is the eternal moment. And that's always true. And so millions of your ancestors built up to the point where in this moment, you and I can be having this conversation. And from this moment, there will be more eternal moments. But, you have to make the most of this moment. You have to make the best of the possibilities, as Dr. Jung put it. And so if the best of your possibilities is sitting here listening to me, and then maybe we're all in trouble. I don't know, but anyway, so I can only show you my way and something about Dr. Jung's way, and then it's up for you. I'm not a mental health professional, so I don't try to advise people from a mental health point of view. I can only say, this is what I've done to keep myself balanced and functional during what for me in my life has been a very tough time. And there have been a lot of ups and downs in my life. Fortunately, the ups outbalance the downs, but when things were darkest, and there have been many occasions like that, going right back to very early part of my life, it's always, at least in the last 33 years, been Dr. Jung that I went back to for solace and to hold myself together. And Dushan says, refuse all religions. I don't say that, because the religions evolved. The religions evolved to help us cope with the world. And we can't slice and dice them to understand what we need and what we don't need. And, for me, I follow both Christianity and Buddhism, but I think that they're both pointing toward the same reality. And I seem to understand things in terms of the rational and the irrational, the logos and the eros, that other people haven't worked out for themselves. And so if you don't think I'm right, that's fine. But, presumably this is what we all have to do. We all have to work through these issues. And so religions can be a form of guidance depending on where you are in your life and whether you can afford to pay a psychoanalyst $150 an hour to work out your psychological difficulties. If you can't afford that, then you might better focus on your religion and look for help there, and you can often find it. So Grenade says, modern religion is not called a religion, but it does exist. Yes, it exists. And each one of us creates a religion of our own. In fact, Thomas More, who's another famous Jungian analyst, wrote a book called A Religion of Your Own. And I urge you to take a look at that. It's a useful one. Let's see. Grenade says, one religion is impossible because there will always be skeptics. Without skepticism, we wouldn't make progress, wouldn't reevaluate our beliefs. Well, that's absolutely true. But what happens is something ineffable emerges. And I can use the United States as an example of that, because notwithstanding all the noise that we hear from our cable news channels, one way or another, whether we're red or blue. Okay, I'm wearing a blue shirt, but I've got a red ball here. Whether we're red or blue, what emerges in the United States is, because we have had every culture in the world, every religion, every ethnic group, every racial group come to this country, we've all been bouncing up against one another for the last 400 years. And the result is that over that 400-year period, from a country that was basically a wilderness, except for a small number of Native Americans, to the most powerful country in the world. And whether it's the best country in the world is quite another question, but what I do know is that if I turn off the television and just go to the grocery store, we all interact perfectly well. Okay, we all live together and our country works. And, even when we have something as frightening as the coronavirus, the clashes that we have within our society it's like tempering steel. It's the way a strong country becomes stronger. And the countries that don't allow those clashes, and there are many of them that are autocratic that don't, they get left behind. And, all you have to do is look around the world to see that. So, okay, let's see. Yeah. Well, it says, at least make yourself acceptable for the courting period. Then when you are married and relaxed again, you will be told what your bad habits are. No doubt. I mean, that's what wives are for. Valis says, I was beheaded by Salome and eaten by King Herod as John the Baptist in my past life. The killing and eating of John the Baptist is at the heart of Western mystery tradition, um, killing and eating of Dionysus is too. Yeah, those are all myths that have made us what we are today. Salome's consciousness turns black in the mystery play because you can't behead John the Baptist. You can't eat Sophia. Sophia's consciousness will get coded into your DNA, which it has been. And even if you don't know about Proverbs 8, you have to take a look at Proverbs 8, paragraphs 1 through 32, and you'll see that the feminine has always been with us since long before Christ came along. And it is coded into our DNA. And remember that philosophy, philosophy, means literally love of Sophia, love of wisdom. And that's where the Sophie of philosophy comes from. So Dusan says, I just quoted what I've heard from your speech. I am not promoting a refusal or a religion. I just like your idea of refusing back religions. Yes, that's what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying that we will ever refuse religions, but we can certainly take them through the crucible. I mean, what I always think of as the molten steel in a steel plant, and it gets heated up till the point where it's red hot, and then it gets pounded. If you think of a Japanese sword called a katana. A katana is the strongest steel in the world. By tradition, it was hammered out literally hundreds of times until every impurity was pounded out of the steel. And that's why Japanese swords are so powerful. I mean, there's a shop in downtown Tokyo called Japanese Sword, in fact. And when you go in there, one of the things about Japanese law is they don't allow you in Japan to have the blade of the sword connected up with the handle. So the handle and the blade are displayed separately. And they have a number of katanas on display. And I once had my nephew, who was a wise kid, with me, and it says, do not touch. And he thought, okay, I'm just going to just touch the blade just to see. And he touched it very, very lightly. And lo and behold, he drew blood. And he almost didn't touch it at all. He touched it so lightly, but it was so sharp and so strong that it drew blood. And that's why they say, do not touch. There's a reason. And so from my perspective, the American society has been built that way, like tempering steel over 400 years, sometimes in a bloody way, but we keep forcing the impurities out of the system, and as a result, the country gets stronger and stronger, whereas autocracies don't, and ultimately autocrats crash. So just think of what Gandhi said. He said that throughout history, there have been tyrants, and for a time they can seem very powerful, but in the end, they always fall. Think of it, always. And that's the truth. And so our arguments, our national political arguments, are our strength. And from them, a truth emerges, which okay, you can say it's this truth today. And yeah, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but it's a process that's uh, permanently going on. It's never going to stop. It's driven by the opposites. And, um, we can just look at the result of it and be amazed. And so, in terms of religion and how we have to interact with religion, if yes, can have our spiritual life in some way explained by psychology, but if we don't look back at our religions, we're not going to understand very much. That's just a personal note. Deucin says, I just quoted what I've heard from your speech. Okay. And I personally believe in God, and prayer worked for me many times. Um, you know, same for me. And we'll talk about God another time, but it's not a question of, in the end, um, in the end, I became like Dr. Jung. I have no need to believe. I know, and I don't have to believe. And I think that many of the people that participate in our advanced reading group are people who've been through God's crucible in a way that um, they too know. And, a specific idea of a specific religion isn't so important, because and you're at the base of your being um, what God is, where God is, and how God goes about doing the work of the Godhead. And so Valis says, Charlemagne the king ate Sophia, Holy Spirit, which is a pink life form, and now it's coded into the DNA of all the Charlemagne's descendants. My consciousness is coded into your DNA. Because of this, I am Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia is the name of perhaps the oldest cathedral in the world, which is in Istanbul. I've actually visited it. It's quite a place. But maybe Hagia Sophia has another meaning too. Maybe Valis will inform us. This is the center of the mysteries. Hagia Sophia knows more Kabbalah than Lucifer. I am faster in Kabbalah than, because I am John the Baptist. I will be rebuking John Rothschild this time. Carl. Yeah. Okay. So Valis, you're giving us a lot of things that are random thoughts, and I'm not saying I'm attuned to that. I just think that it's useful to know something about the Kabbalah and about Hagia Sophia and Sophia herself. Um, and so, and Dushan says he visited the Hagia Sophia last year. The Hagia Sophia is a very unique structure because it was built around 550 AD, so long before there were mechanical tools. And traditionally in Western Europe, cathedrals like Chartres or Notre Dame took 100 years to build. And even the cathedral, the National Cathedral here in the United States, took 100 years to build. And the Hagia Sophia took 5 years. And it's quite an interesting story how they built it. But they built a dome in that building, which has stood there since 550 AD. And for 1,000 years, it was the largest dome in the world until St. Peter's was built in the 15th century, I believe. So until St. Peter's was built, It was the largest dome in the world. And it's quite an amazing feat to have been built that way, the way it was. Um, and you can only honor the men who built that structure 1600 years ago. My gosh. So anyway, but I'm often awed by major things like that. If you go to Osaka Castle in Japan, you can also be quite amazed, because there's one stone in the outer wall of Osaka Castle that's, I think, 35 square meters in its face, and so it has to weigh, I don't know, probably 50 tons or something like that. And how Japanese, about 500 years ago, put that stone in place, I have no clue, but it's just an amazing feat of engineering to see it happen. Okay, I have to move on because my wife is being, she's got the whip, and I overstayed yesterday, so I have to terminate. But so this has been, I've been reading the Bible and the Psyche, Individuation, Symbolism in the Old Testament by Edward Edinger. And the purpose of this is to help you understand this perspective, this psychological perspective on the Western religions. And so I will continue with chapter 2 tomorrow, and we'll see how it goes. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.